When it seemed that the long years of partnership and integration between neighboring countries, Canada and the United States, had entered a stable trajectory, and that this year's escalation had subsided, the final week of October brought a sudden turn capable of jeopardizing one of the most stable trade relationships in the world. In a rapid sequence of diplomatic signals and hardline economic actions, a new chapter of Canada-US confrontation has emerged, and its spark came from what appeared to be a simple television commercial. The Canadian province of Ontario commissioned an audio-visual advertisement aired in the United States featuring a speech by former President Ronald Reagan. In his 1987 radio address, Reagan reflected on the meaning of free and fair trade while criticizing tariff barriers. The Ontario government used this fragment to highlight the negative consequences of trade restrictions and convey a message. Canada is a victim of high American barriers, and it is time to level the playing field. But Washington did not see it as mere advertising. It saw a challenge and a provocation. First, U.S. officials considered the use of Reagan's speech without prior approval a questionable maneuver. Second, the ad was perceived as a calculated information attack on U.S. policy, not just a trade dispute, but a direct hostile act. According to The Guardian, President Donald Trump took notice of the controversy and declared via his account that the advertisement was a hostile act and that he was now raising tariffs on Canada. Thus, just days before their scheduled discussions, on October 24, 2025, the United States officially announced that all trade negotiations with Canada were suspended until further notice. This came alongside Trump's statement that tariffs on Canadian goods would rise by an additional 10% above existing levels. The next day, on October 25th, Reuters reported Trump's words, "I am raising tariffs on Canada by an additional 10% on top of what they are paying now." Time was ticking, and the traditionally calm Canada-US relationship suddenly began to tremble. Analysts wrote that the suspension of talks was a clear signal of serious deterioration. According to sources, the Canadian government was thrown into a state of near panic. Prime Minister Mark Carney quickly announced that the province of Ontario would suspend the ad campaign following talks between Canada's federal government and Ontario's leadership. However, insiders said this statement was mainly meant to reassure Washington. The ad's actual suspension was expected, but not yet confirmed, and Ontario, under pressure, had to adjust its position. What matters is that this escalation is not happening in a vacuum. In recent months, Canada had already tried to rebalance its position, for instance, by lifting many retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods and signaling a desire to restore normal trade conditions. Now, the situation has changed. Not just the threat of tariffs, but a full halt in dialogue, pushing the relationship to a new level of risk. Experts say this is more than a dispute over an ad or tariffs. It is a signal that the United States, under Trump's administration, intends to show Canada that any public attempt to call out American policy will be treated as a threat and punished with sanctions. At the same time, Canada, a long-standing and reliable partner, has suddenly found itself under pressure. Analysts from leading publications emphasize that halting negotiations with Canada is a rare and troubling precedent. What is at stake? First, the economic consequences. Higher tariffs on Canadian exports to the U.S. mean increased costs for Canadian manufacturers, reduced competitiveness, and rising prices for raw materials and intermediate goods. Second, the political effects. Internal pressure is expected to rise in Canada as export-oriented provinces begin to express frustration with the federal government for its perceived weakness in defending national interests. Inside the country, awareness is growing that the previous economic safe zone under U.S. protection is no longer guaranteed. A third aspect is geopolitical. The Allied status remains formally intact, but trust has been seriously damaged. The Time notes that the Ontario advertisement became a trigger, and agencies interviewed in Ottawa and Washington confirmed that dialogue was halted not because of the specific content, but because of the symbolic effect, showing that Canada was, in essence, criticizing the United States on American soil. In Washington, insiders in the White House Trade Office say they cannot allow a neighboring partner to use the American audience to undermine White House policy. These remarks, given on condition of anonymity, underscore that the matter has gone beyond pure economics. The system is perceived as a tool of state pressure. Meanwhile, the Canadian side is trying to navigate the situation. Prime Minister Mark Carney stated that Canada is ready to resume negotiations, but only on a respectful, equal footing. He reminded that Canada is not just a supplier of raw materials, it is a partner country. Nevertheless, an immediate easing of tensions is unlikely. The United States has already signaled that talks are possible only after conditions previously not publicly stated by Washington are met. From a legal and institutional risk perspective, part of Canadian exports to the United States still falls under USMCA. However, in the current situation, it is the refusal to negotiate and the tariff increase that serve as symbols. Even USMCA-compliant goods may be subject to political decisions, forcing companies on both sides to reconsider supply chains and risk assessments. Economic circles are already issuing warnings. If the situation drags on, the Canadian economy, heavily dependent on exports, could enter a zone of risk. Reuters notes that Canada will now have to maneuver between protecting domestic production chains and avoiding full disconnection from the critically important American market. Thus, we stand on the threshold of a new era. Where trade neighborliness was once taken for granted, now the question is whether Canada can maintain a balance between export needs and the risk of US pressure. The coming weeks are likely to be extremely tense. There may be no talk of preliminary agreements or a rollback. On the contrary, the next escalation is probable. What scenarios seem most likely? First, the United States may further increase tariffs or expand the list of goods subject to duties. Second, non-tariff measures may be imposed. Quotas, investment controls, or restrictions on Canadian companies' access to the US market. Third, further delays in negotiations could lead to growing economic uncertainty and possibly internal political unrest in Canada. For Canada, swift and decisive action is essential. It must either show the US that the advertisement has been stopped and that Ontario is cooperating in negotiations, or face new harsh American measures. For the United States, the situation sends a signal to other partners. If you publicly criticize US trade policy, expect retaliatory actions. In summary, we are witnessing not just another trade dispute, but a real diplomatic and economic fault line that could reshape Canada-US relations for years. The suspension of negotiations and a 10% tariff increase are not trivial. They mark a return to the era of trade wars and pragmatic alliances. If Canada does not respond decisively and quickly, the stable foundation that has shaped North American relations for decades may begin to crumble. This is why today serves as a marker that even the closest allies can find themselves on the brink of conflict if diplomacy gives way to PR campaigns and public provocations. In a world where economic and political power increasingly intersect, we see that an advertisement can trigger tariffs, and tariffs can be the start of something much larger.